The first step in configuring OTJ is to configure the email platform you are integrating with. At a high level, each physical room that will have a one-touch join endpoint needs an associated room resource with an email address. Enable auto-calendar processing for each room resource. You must have appropriate administration rights in the email platform to make the relevant changes. The steps to complete the integration vary depending on which email platform is being used. Refer to docs.pexip.com for a thorough and step-by-step guide. The demonstration shows an OTJ integration to Office 365, using Graph API, being added to Infinity. The prerequisite steps in Office 365 and Azure have already been completed. An OTJ profile is created to link together all the components for a particular deployment. Exchange, Office 365, or Google Workspace integration. Endpoint groups, and therefore endpoints. Rules to be used to process meeting invitations. A single one-touch join profile is associated with a single OTJ email integration type. However, a one-touch join profile can contain a mixture of Cisco and Poly endpoints. The profile can be associated with one or more endpoint groups. A profile has several configuration elements which are used as the defaults for how meetings are processed and how endpoints display the OTJ meetings. You can control the following for meetings: the number of days of upcoming meetings to be shown on endpoints, whether to display non-video meetings on the endpoint. This can be useful occupancy information for a room to inform users of any bookings for a particular room. Whether or not meetings flagged as private are processed by the one-touch join service. Option to replace the meeting subject for security reasons, either with the organizer's name or custom value by using a script. There is configuration included for Cisco endpoints using one button to push, where Infinity is directly talking to the endpoints to populate the endpoint calendar. The config allows a set of defaults and common configuration to use for the Cisco endpoints associated to this profile. The number of minutes before and after a meeting's scheduled start time that the Join button will be shown on the endpoint. Default username and password for Infinity nodes to authenticate with Cisco endpoints. This is useful if endpoints in the fleet use the same admin credentials. Whether or not to verify the TLS certificate of a Cisco OBTP endpoint. Whether or not to use HTTPS by default when accessing a Cisco OBTP endpoint. Note that these options can be overridden in the OTJ endpoint configuration, if required. The profile can also be enabled for WebEx integration, to enable OTJ for WebEx or WebEx Edge-registered devices. To enable this, a WebEx integration needs to be set up. Endpoint groups, as the name implies, logically groups VC endpoints together. Each endpoint can belong to only one endpoint group, but an endpoint group can contain a mix of Cisco OBTP and Poly OTD endpoints. We recommend that all endpoints in the same physical location are assigned to a single endpoint group. Each endpoint group is associated with a system location, and nodes in the selected location will run the OTJ process to serve the group. Reminder: if there are more than 5 conferencing nodes in a location, only 5 will be actively running OTJ. Each individual endpoint needs to be represented in Infinity by creating an OTJ endpoint entry. For all endpoint types, the room resource email, to which the endpoint is associated, needs to be specified. It must be associated with an OTJ endpoint group. Decide whether to raise an alarm in the Infinity Management node if there is a problem providing the endpoint with meeting information. When adding the endpoint, the type is selected, and different options are presented for each type. For Cisco OBTP endpoints, the endpoint address is required for Infinity to push the meetings. There are also options which allow you to override the default endpoint credentials and options, already specified in the OTJ profile. For Poly endpoints, you must provide credentials to be used for the endpoint to authenticate with Infinity for OTJ services. These credentials are used in the endpoint calendaring config when pointing the calendaring configuration towards Infinity. Cisco WebEx registered endpoints need to provide a device ID, which is created when an OTJ and WebEx integration is completed. For OTJ to function, you must configure Infinity with information about all the different types of meeting invitations you expect to encounter, and rules for how the information in each of these invitations should be used to identify the meeting alias that the endpoint will use to populate the join button. OneTouch Join supports meetings from several different providers. For each of these supported meeting types, OneTouch Join knows what information to look for in the meeting invitation, and how to use what it finds to derive a meeting alias. In most cases, you can simply use the default processing for each supported meeting type. However, you also have the option to override the default processing with your own transform pattern to change how the alias is constructed. You can also write your own regex and custom rules if you wish to enable OneTouch Join for other meeting types or conferencing providers not currently supported. A single OneTouch Join profile will normally have multiple meeting processing rules associated with it. We recommend that you create one rule for each meeting type you expect users in your environment to encounter, including any invitations received from external contacts where users may wish to use an internal meeting room to join the meeting. The meeting rules should be assigned appropriate priority to ensure that all rules for supported meeting types are processed before any domain, regex, or custom rules. Note that the order in which the supported meeting types are prioritized between themselves is not important. Each meeting rule is associated to a specific OTJ profile, therefore you can have a different set of processing rules per profile. When testing OTJ and you are getting unexpected results, there is a custom debug rule which can be added to log all properties and the body of the meeting invite to aid with troubleshooting. However, it should only ever be enabled temporarily for the purposes of troubleshooting. If using Infinity as your calling platform, you must also ensure that your deployment has an appropriate dial plan in place to enable the OTJ endpoint to dial the meeting alias obtained from the invite. Via the management node, it's possible to view the status of your OneTouch Join deployment by viewing a list of all currently scheduled OneTouch Join meetings. Also provided is a list of all endpoints enabled for OTJ. Status information can be particularly useful when troubleshooting OTJ issues. If problems are encountered when setting up OTJ, or once it has been successfully deployed, the docs provide excellent guidance on how to approach issues. It should be your first step in identifying the problem and to learn how to resolve it. A high percentage of OTJ issues can be solved just by reading and following the advice in the docs. There is a page, Troubleshooting OneTouch Join, which lists common issues with suggestions on how to fix them. You may also see errors with OTJ presented as alarms in the management node. The docs page, Viewing Alarms, includes reference to all OTJ alarms with information on the likely cause and steps to mitigate.